Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Jay Post. I am a assistant professor at Arkansas Tech University. I'm also the vice president of the Wilderness Education Association, and I just started a new business called BEAR, Backcountry Education Adventure Research. So I'm going to be kind of talking more on the research side of it. Cameron, introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, everyone, or whatever time it is, wherever you are around the world right now. My name is Cameron, like Jay and Jamie just mentioned. I work at TCU as a senior consultant for learning and development with TCU's Human Resource Department. I recently was, is it a promotion or a demotion when you go from being the outdoor program director to an HR consultant? It depends on who you ask, but that was the shift that happened. So I spent the last 5 years in the outdoor rec world at TCU, and then the previous 10 before that running a nonprofit in Los Angeles, as well as being a high school and middle school teacher and principal at a high school in downtown Los Angeles.
Okay, so this presentation, in this short amount of time, we're going to talk a little bit about research, and we're going to be talking about apprenticeship and how those kind of come about. So the purpose of the research that Cameron and I were looking at was to investigate the phenomenon of outdoor spirituality from the perspective of outdoor leaders. And this was kind of bridging off of some of my previous research that I've done. But our trip together that we had in 2019 was also an apprenticeship. And the purpose of that was to help a graduate student, Cameron, with first-hand experience in research with a new methodology that he hadn't previously had experience with. And then also to help him with his independent study, he got college credit for helping out on this project. Now, I also want to say I don't have a WA PowerPoint for you because this project was actually funded mostly by my institution, and so they really want their name to be on it. They had no relevance of the outcome of the findings. They just gave me some money to go out and do some research. So, and that also afforded me some opportunities to bring someone along with me, because the gas, lodging, all that, it was going to pretty much be the same amount of money with me being alone or with me having a printer with me. So that was something quite lucky. Now, kind of a background so you can kind of wrap your mind around some of this. I do want to specify what's the difference between spirituality and religion. So spirituality is this really big concept, and it can mean a lot of different things. For me, if I was to just say it in one sentence, it's about answering the unanswerable questions, which means it's pretty personal to that person. Now, that's different than religion, because religion is about a set of doctrines, rules, beliefs that are commonly valued by a group of people. And so these are two different things. Sometimes people can feel spirituality in something that's religious, but people also feel spirituality outside of what religion can offer. So those are some things to kind of wrap your mind about. We are focusing on spirituality at this point. Now, this is going to be kind of tagging on the back end of several other studies. In 2015, I did a pilot study when I was a graduate student, and then that turned into my dissertation. So the perceptions of outdoor leaders towards their spirituality and nature. And you could find that document in the Whova app. And if you notice, inside the document, perceptions is spelled correctly. On the outside, when it was being published, unfortunately, they switched an R and an E. So that wasn't my typo. That was, unfortunately, Oklahoma State University's typo. Kind of put that there. But then after I had graduated and they kind of gave me the blessing of, having a PhD, I wanted to see, well, do these findings expand even more? And so with other research funds, I went to Japan and I redid my dissertation and kind of came up with similar findings. And that was cool, but also, as we'll see later on towards the end, well, I was hoping for a little bit more. So the methodology that we were utilizing for our research was Q methodology. It's very obscure. Most people have no idea about Q methodology. While most research is trying to narrow down and figuring out, something very specific, Q methodology is trying to expand out and be like, well, how big, how broad is this subject? Now, with it, it's about different phenomenons, and it's about the here and now. It's not about generalization. It's not about testing something or theory verification. It should enact something to where it's like, hey, we find several new things each time. Now, it's kind of a mixed methodology because it also gives us kind of the numbers for the quantitative people, but then it also gives us the stories for the qualitative people. So it's a pretty neat methodology. And if you have, inklings of like, hey, I'd like to learn more about that, again, talk to your institution, see if there's anyone that knows how to teach it, or even contact me and we can, maybe set something up that might be more unofficial. But with it, we got to know that these people were looking at what was subjective and what was from their first person perceptions, their viewpoints. And what they did was they ordered these different cards. And so what I did is during my pilot, I went out there and I looked at all sorts of stuff that had to do with the outdoors and spirituality. And from there, I was coming up with basically 300 statements. And I was starting to find out I was repeating myself a whole lot as I was looking through the literature. Now, from there, I had to narrow it down. And so I was putting things in different categories and seeing what was similar, what was different. And I was able to bring it down to 42 statements. And this is just a sample of some of these statements that we had there. And so some of it comes from John Muir. Some of it comes from Edward Abbey. Some of it comes from various religious texts that are out there. I mean, I was scouring a lot of places. And so, yeah, this is just a little tiny sample of them. Now, what happens is the people will take these 42 statements and they make different piles of, hey, I understand this statement. It resonates with me really well. So they put that in one pile. This statement, I don't like that statement. I don't necessarily feel that. It doesn't compute from my experiences. And they put it into a different one. And then maybe another one that's kind of in the middle. And then they start kind of rank ordering them to those extremes and then work their way towards that center. And from there is able to give them some quantifiable rankings of +5 to -5. And for our study, we had 21 sorters that we looked at. And on this, these were people who led trips that were kayaking, being flat water, salt, sea kayaking, whitewater, sailing, scuba and snorkeling. I mean, anything that was water-based, and that's what these leaders were focusing on. And so they sorted these and we put it through a system. Luckily, we don't have to hand calculate this thing. It goes through a computer, and 3 major factors came up. So 3 themes. And from there, we kind of came up with the sense of bettering oneself. That was factor number 1. Factor number 2, the sense of connecting to a higher power and others. And then the third factor, the sense of emotional connection. And so with these, it was like, oh, well, these are some really good categories. And we kind of started looking at some of the stories that kind of went behind it. So on that factor one that we had for the sense of bettering oneself, some of the more common statement cards that were ranked very highly was, the more I spend in the outdoors, the more relief my soul gets. I feel like my true self when I'm in nature. I feel my consciousness and unconsciousness coming into balance. And so with these, they're very internal feelings for these individuals that kind of went with this factor. There's, almost like an relaxation when they're going into nature. And they're recovering from the challenges of what life is. And so, and there's also a little bit of this unseen reality. These are not concrete ideas that these individuals are getting from this. And so these are some of those characteristics that came from this factor. Now, that second factor, the sense of connecting to one's higher power and others, some of the, top cards that they sorted, God is nothing but true love. God speaks through those I'm with in nature. In nature, I can feel there's more than just a physical world. Be silent and hear the whisper of God. And so with this factor, there's a big connection more on that, what some people would say a traditional spiritual sense, to God and to fellowship. And so it's very spiritual. Now, it's also bringing that spirituality from an external source, being in nature. And so that was really important to these people who sorted like this factor. Now, factor 3, the sense of emotional connection. Some of the statements were, the pure magnitude of nature makes me feel humble. I am so grateful. I am filled with compassion and empathy. I can see evolution firsthand in nature. And so with this, again, very emotional for these individuals who sorted this way. And they feel like it has something productive that they're getting from it. And it's very connected to that physical world. And of course, there's the wow, sense when you're in nature. And so these were some of the, big ideas that came from this research. And I found that this was great. And so I went back and I looked at my previous findings from the other studies. So looking back all the way to the pilot study that we had, there was a sense of self, a sense of God, a sense of fellowship, a sense of connectiveness. So I'm seeing some parallels there. And then during my dissertation, there was the sense of transcending, the sense of God, higher power, and fellowship, the sense of challenge, and the importance of wilderness. And the importance of wilderness kind of ran through all of them. It was something that was very common for all 3 of those factors. And then when I went to Japan and had my study there with with Taido, there was the sense of awareness towards improving self, the sense of connecting to others in a higher power, and the sense of aesthetics to nature and scenery in one's heart. Does anyone else see some commonalities between all of these? I do, you know, and so while Q methodology isn't supposed to narrow down and be like, hey, this is, you know, how this happens, it's supposed to broaden. And so part of me, when I'm looking at the methodology, I'm like, okay, did I do something wrong? Because these are very similar. I mean, the factor 3 kind of changes, but the factor 1 and 2, they meld so well together. So maybe outdoor leaders kind of have some of these similar things. Maybe we need to look at participants. Maybe we need to look at people who really don't go into the outdoors and what their perceptions are, you know, to really kind of broaden our vocabulary with what is outdoor spirituality. Now, that's cool that we had some findings, you know, that's great, but how do we use it? What are some of the takeaways from this? And so for this, this can help expand the outdoor leaders' awareness of how others experience outdoor spirituality. While you may fall into one of these categories, you gotta be aware that other people may have different experiences, even while they're there hiking right along with you or paddling right there with you. They could have a whole entire other perception. And then another thing is, if you're having a secular, non-religious outdoor trip, this still can be a spiritual experience. It could be very powerful for those individuals. And so maybe help people along, listen to their story, and maybe help them with, you know, building upon that. You know, if they're looking for more fellowship, help them with that. If they're looking for that sense of challenge, of, you know, improving themselves, okay, help them with that. If they want to, you know, tear down the barriers of whatever's going on, well, we could help them with that, you know. And so it's just kind of having these little conversations with people. Now, that was kind of the research side of things. And that was kind of half of what we did for the summer of 2019. But the other half was apprenticing. You know, I gave Cameron some different resources to read before we went there. We went over, well, here's the steps of how I prepared, you know, all that background stuff from that concourse, getting all those statements and narrowing it down to 42, you know, how to put together the physical elements that people sort. No, we went through all that. And then we hit the road and went out to California to talk to a whole lot of outdoor leaders on the coastline. And so we got to talk the whole entire time through this, asking questions. And he challenged me a lot because there's, you know, I'd learned this in grad school a while back ago. So I had to now relearn some of the things that I just kind of took for granted. And I thought that was great for helping me be a better researcher. Cameron, how was the apprenticeship for you?
Yeah, well, just briefly, because I think the research side of this is probably the more interesting side, but this is a really important part of it as well. The apprenticeship side was particularly fruitful, I would say, for me. The way this came about, honestly, as these things often do, is that I had hit a point in my own studies where they didn't offer classes on the time frame I needed them to offer classes, and I needed a research class. And so I said, hey, Jay, what are you doing this summer? You want to hang out? Because I had heard that he was doing a research trip. And the way that most programs work, and mine is no exception, is that the faculty and the staff of the program really wanted to work with me. And so they said, if you can figure out something independent, if it's research-based, if you can justify it, absolutely go for it. And so Jay and I worked together on the WEA board at that point. And so I was able to connect with him. He hasn't mentioned this yet. It was a road trip. He started in Arkansas. He picked me up in Fort Worth, Texas, and we drove to California. And there was a third partner that was involved in this process we haven't mentioned. Chaco, his dog, came with us the whole way too. So it was a couple 1,000-mile road trip with Jay, Cameron, and Chaco. So it was the three of us, the three amigos. It was really informative. And I really feel like at some point, probably on day 2 of the drive out to California, I'm exaggerating a little bit here, but I think I had gotten to the point where I was annoying Jay to death, where I was like, okay, but Q method, this part still doesn't make sense to me, right? Because as you mentioned a moment ago, most research takes a big idea and really zooms in and puts it under a microscope and tries to pull out an answer. And Q method does the exact opposite. It essentially says, we don't know what exists out there, but we want to find more information. We want to find more knowledge rather than trying to solve a specific question. Essentially, it says, what kinds of people are there when it comes to the issue of this specific concourse, these questions, these phrases, as people sort them? And you noticed in the slide that Jay had up earlier, they do it in a way that looks like a bell curve. If you're of the statistical mind, they automatically put those into a bell curve so that we kind of see like what's most extremely like them, what's kind of the furthest deviation positive, and what's the least like them. And so it does kind of naturally lend itself to a bit of that quantitative nature. And the thing that's really interesting about that is you put all the information in and hit the analyze button once the computer program has all the information, and it essentially tells you, hey, there's some clustering, some factors that are in common. And so it's normal that there are these 3 different types of people, like Jay talked about with this study specifically, when they approach specifically water-based activities, when they think about it from a spiritual lens. These are the 3 different types of people that tend to think about these things through these kinds of lenses. And so in that way, it's so opposite from the research that I had done in the past, and so different because, again, it's essentially putting an open-ended question out into the world and allowing people to answer that question, and allowing the program and the analysis, the quantitative side, to really do the analysis for you to figure out, hey, there's some clustering here around folks that put this like religious, spiritual part of the outdoor experience as being really important. And there's people that put that same exact card, that concourse card, on the other extreme as the least important thing for them. And one of the things that I found it to be helpful and a bit eye-opening for me was recognizing that I often, unconsciously mostly, but assume that there is a way, there is a path, right? When you think about spirituality and the outdoors, right? You sometimes think about religiously affiliated programs, or you think about the like yogi that's sitting cross-legged on top of a mountaintop meditating. And there's these stereotypes that kind of surround the concepts. And rather than living into or asking questions about those, the process here with the research specifically was really informative when it came to thinking about kind of, again, open-ended, getting the researcher out of the way, getting me and Jay out of the way somewhat, so that the folks that we're interviewing can answer the questions for us. So I know some of this is in the chat here that I'm seeing come through, but I'll also address just briefly the way that it worked with regard to the research process and participants in the research, is that there was some things that we had lined up ahead of time, but for the most part, it was just snowball. We connected with a couple of friends that we had out on the West Coast, but mostly we said, hey, thank you so much for sitting with us and answering these questions and sorting these cards. Who else do you know that would be interested in doing the same kind of thing that also works with water or adventure in nature, specifically around a water-based activity? And they would snowball another participant, and then we ask that person, who else do you know, or what other businesses do you know nearby? And so the research process itself was kind of an adventure. It fits with this crowd. We didn't really have a plan going into it. Again, there was a couple connections that we knew kind of up and down the coast of California, but for the most part, it was well, where do you want to go today? I guess we can go to the boardwalk and see, like, there's a scuba shop down there. Let's see if they're interested, right? Or there's a kayak guiding company. Let's see who they've got. And so we did a lot of kind of wandering around and showing up in shops and asking people like, do you have 15 minutes to sort some cards on a piece of paper for us? And they were very confused, but ended up being really, really interesting samples at the same time, because it's not just a network of people that are connected somehow to Jay or myself. They're literally strangers that had a wide range of experiences when it came to water-based activities. So in a way, the random sampling of that population makes the research a bit more powerful. that's a lot. I could say a lot more about that, but I want to be conscious of the time and the questions I see coming in. So that's a bit of my perspective on the research process itself.
Yeah, it definitely is very interesting. And to kind of get some more demographics, everyone was over 18. I think the youngest we had was 19 on there. And it went all the way up to 67, I think was our oldest for this one. Now, in some of the other research, I had people about 75, 76 has been the oldest in those. But I've always kept everything above 18 for, ease of that. Now, with it, we had some universities. As he mentioned, we had some different independent, providers that were there. Ended up talking with kind of a group that kind of had a nature center that led trips as well. And so kind of went all over the place with that. And again, we wanted to have that variety and not just people who automatically thought like me and Cameron. So hopefully that answered your question, Flip. Now this one, I'm not for sure. I didn't ask anyone on veterans. I'm assuming one of our participants was a veteran, but in some of my other studies, I did go to some military bases that had outdoor adventure and asked some of them and some of their interns on it. So that dissertation one did have people from military backgrounds. Well, as we are finishing up here is some of our contact information. If you have, more questions, again, reach out to us. We'll probably be able to be able to answer these as the next few days go along. And yeah, thank you so much. Anything else from you, Cameron?
No, I see we've got just maybe 2 minutes or so, but if we've got questions that you want to throw into the chat now, I see Seth just threw it in there, or unmute yourself and ask real quick. We've got a couple minutes to kind of hang out and answer some questions if they're short. Otherwise, we'll defer you to our emails.
Cameron, do you want to go ahead and look at Seth's question? The question is, what has been the interest in your research presentation from both secular and religious affiliated programs?
I'm going to let Jay answer that question, actually, since he's done a lot more of this research.
When we've gone to several of these programs on both sides of things, they've always been like, yeah, we'll participate in whatever it is, except occasionally when they are super busy and, can't fit us in at that time. But, sometimes we get with, different camps that have a religious kind of bent to them. But I wasn't necessarily seeking out, these groups. I have thought about expanding the next one to maybe be just religious affiliated programs and see if something else emerges from that.
Jay, can you put the findings slide back up?
As Jay's doing that, just one final note and thought from me. I think it's fascinating because especially those of us that have had experience with like a religiously affiliated program or a camp or a nonprofit or a church or college, there's so many. I think especially in those spaces, there can be an assumption that people approach wilderness or outdoors for a certain kind of religious or spiritual experience. And I think one of the things that's really interesting about these findings is that regardless of the background demographic that these participants were coming from, there are a number of different types of approaches to both the outdoors and spirituality, right? And this last one, obviously 2019 was water-based, but that was not the case for these previous studies that Jay did. And so thinking about how you're meeting the needs of the participants that show up on your trip, whether it's explicitly religious or intended to be spiritual or not, there are spiritual applications and outcomes that your participants are engaging in and are participating at some level in. And it's interesting to see how they're walking away with some of those lessons from these experiences.